Good afternoon. Welcome to today's construction insurance market update, which is a question and answer session with Griffiths and Armour and Hill Dickinson. Michael Woolley and Roger Moore will discuss the latest changes and how they affect those in the industry. Michael Woolley is a member of the Hill Dickinson construction and engineering team and has a wealth of experience in insurance matters within the industry, including dealing with contentious and non-contentious work, often addressing the implications that insurance has on projects. And Roger Moore is a client services director at Griffiths and Armour, one of the UK's largest independent insurance brokers and a market leader in the construction sector. Roger specialises in construction and has more than 30 years experience of advising developers, contractors and professional consultants on their risk and insurance requirements, covering both annual and project specific placements. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please can we ask that everyone can ensure that their cameras are turned off. This means that we can have Michael and Roger very clearly on screen. It's intended to be an interactive session, so please can you write questions that you may have in the comments box, and at the end of the session we'll work our way through as many as we can. The session is being recorded and a copy will be made available after the session starts. So for those that are just joining through now, if you can make sure your cameras are switched off, and then we'll start with the first question. Our first question is directed towards Roger. From dealing with construction contracts at Hill Dickinson, we get the impression that there have been significant changes in the construction insurance market recently. From a broker's point of view, can you outline what you think those changes are?
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. It is probably fair to say that the insurance market is going through probably one of its most challenging periods, certainly for the last 20 years. The market's always been very cyclical, so we have upward price movements and lower price movements, but we've probably had a reduction in pricing, broadening of cover for the last 15 to 20 years in the market. And what we've seen is really a bit of a knee-jerk reaction from insurers, and we're now in the full throes of a hardening market. What this means for construction and construction insurance is the main impacts have really been on professional indemnity, contract works and delay and completion insurance. We are seeing a reduction in the capacities that insurers will offer. We are seeing a dramatic, or have seen some dramatic increases in rating. We're seeing insurers impose some significant self-insured requirements, and we're also seeing insurers impose some pretty restrictive cover and exclusions on policy wordings, and I know we'll cover some of those exclusions later on in the presentation. One thing I would say, certainly from a PI perspective, is worryingly, perhaps, we're still somewhat below the pricing level of the early 2000s. So whilst everyone is feeling the pain, there may still potentially be some further pain to come.
Great, thank you. And Michael, as one of the team that deals with construction contracts regularly at Hill Dickinson, how are these such changes in the market affecting contractual discussions?
Thanks, Katie, and good afternoon, everybody. I think the things that we're seeing, to be honest with you, are that insureds are being more conscious about the risks that they face, and more robust, particularly on ensuring that in the contracts, professional appointments and the like, they are including limits on liability and maintaining exclusions where they can, so that they make sure that they're not exposed more than they have to be. And I think in some cases, I'd say that we're seeing very active risk management from insured. So, for example, we know as a fact that some people have say a limit of indemnity, but they have a range of insurance certificates for a lower limit of indemnity, and they will, if they can, try and negotiate to achieve the lower limit of indemnity because it's a better risk presentation when they come to talk to their insurers, to be able to say, well, we've got a certain number of contracts at limit X, certain number of contracts at limit Y, and that looks a more attractive prospect. So I would say definitely seeing more active risk management and therefore more robust negotiation in terms of contracts.
Great. And Roger, with that view of the marketplace, what do you feel are the main factors that are driving premium levels and availability of cover at the moment?
Historical loss ratios, I think, is probably the key driving factor. PI in particular has probably been the worst performing class of insurance for many years for some insurers, and there was a major review, which was one of the triggers for the hard market, really. There was a major review at Lloyd's in 2018, and what's effectively happened since that review is many of the underwriters at Lloyd's who wrote PI historically have either completely withdrawn from the market or have significantly reduced the capacity that they will offer. But we are influenced by other factors. Grenfell is there in the background, as we all know. And there are many insurers post-Grenfell that are sat there with £100 million plus reserves on their portfolio. And they're all very nervous about, the Grenfell inquiry, which is very much, as we know, in the public domain, and what that's throwing up in terms of their potential future liabilities, ex-Grenfell, but obviously all the replacement cladding costs. And I saw something the other day in the press that indicated that this 15 billion figure that's being thrown around is a bit of an underestimation. It might be near a 50 billion figure. So there is a major concern there. Outside of PI, on contract works, there were some very, very significant international losses, but because of the presence and nature of the UK market, they do flow back into London, because London is really the lead international market. And here in the UK, we've been largely impacted by a very large increase in water damage claims. I think this is more to do with the modern methods of construction, the disappearance of the old copper pipe and new modern methods, but ultimately they're not as risk secure from insurers' perspective. So they've been dealing with 7 or even 8-figure water damage claims. There were also a couple of high-profile fires in the UK. So generally, in summary, it's claims that's driving the premium.
Okay, great. And then looking now at the individual client level, do insurers require their clients to include limitations of liability within consultant appointments or building contracts? And how prescriptive can insurers be with their requirements?
Yeah, well, this was a point that Michael touched on. Insurers, I mean, generally speaking, most insurers would not normally impose it as a specific requirement on their insurance policy, although it's impossible to speak for all insurers and all of their policies. But to me, as Michael said, it seems from the consultants and contractors' perspective to be reasonable risk management that if you have a particular restriction or limitation on your insurance, to try to ensure that the contract that you're signing up to from an indemnity perspective, worst case, reflects the insurance cover that you're relying on to indemnify you. Ultimately, it's got to be a commercial decision for the consultants and contractor whether they enter into a contract without such a limitation on their liability. But I think there does need to be an open dialogue with the employer on these issues, and there needs to be some recognition that the market is going through some very difficult challenges. The consultants and contractors are having their insurance protection that they rely on restricted, and therefore it doesn't, to me, seem unreasonable that risk should not. I mean, the problem is we've always risk dumped in the construction sector, and dumping that risk down the supply chain is just not viable at the present time, because the supply chain doesn't have the insurance cover to protect itself.
Yeah, and just flowing through from that, Michael, are you seeing much feedback from contractors and consultants when you're trying to negotiate the contracts with them?
I think feedback from consultants has certainly been increasing over the past few years. From contractors, it's probably a little less so than is the case with consultants. The contractors seem more prepared to accept a risk, and I think that that's probably because that's been the case historically. Consultants seem to have been more alert to the need to match up with their professional indemnity cover, and that's probably been slightly less so with contractors, I would say, in my experience. But I think increasingly they're becoming alert to those risks and very much looking to try and impose limitations. I think looking at the examples of the contracts that we commonly see, you don't always tend to see limitations in standard form JCT, and the amendments that have been made to them have been historically, I would say, client driven rather than contractor driven. So that's probably been part of the reason for limitations not coming in so readily, but I think people are becoming more alert to it and certainly looking to try and limit their overall exposure, and particularly in exposure to consequential loss. And of course, the thing to bear in mind with these sort of claims, particularly on a professional indemnity policy, is that it's not necessarily the policy in force that's at the time the works are being carried out, but it's when the claim might be made, which may be a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, even up to 12 years after the event. So people are looking not only at the marketplace today, but what the marketplace may look like in the future.
Katie, can I just chip in there on my points that Michael made? One, from our perspective, we're definitely starting to see contractors kicking back against some of the requirements. It seems to be in the subcontractor supply chain. Mm-hmm. And the way it works is the main contractor enters into the design and build, but then looks to pass those risks down the supply chain through collateral warranties and back-to-back contract obligations. And the tier 1 contractors, most of them probably still have the clout and leverage that they're probably not feeling some of the restrictions. They'll be getting some, but not the same restrictions that the subcontractor and consultant supply chain are finding imposed on them. We are definitely seeing, from our perspective, subcontractors basically kicking back against main contractors, who are then starting to say, well, we don't want this risk resting with us now, and they're therefore pushing back to employers.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Just by way of reminder, just at this point, for people that have joined late, can we just make sure that all the cameras are turned off, please? And for those people that have got questions that they want to ask and are raising their hands, we will be taking questions at the end, but by way of written questions. So there is a chat function within this conversation. If you want to type your questions up in there and we can address them at the end, that'd be great. Just moving on now, Roger, I know that you've already mentioned Grenfell. Michael, is this something that you're seeing more? Are you seeing more exceptions in relation to fire and cladding? And what's the practical effect of this for clients?
Yeah, absolutely. We've noticed quite a lot that you find that limits of indemnity for fire resistance and cladding are quite often in the aggregate. and for some consultants we find that they're excluded altogether. And this is going to be speculation on my part, and Roger can jump in a minute, but I do wonder whether that's because some people may have notified of a risk of a claim, circumstances that might give rise to a claim, and that's a possible reason for an exclusion entirely. But yes, very much so, and I suspect that that's going to in fact get worse over the next couple of years. I see no reason for the situation to soften in relation to cladding. If anything, it's going to probably become a little bit harder. That would be my guess. Yeah, Roger, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
And this kind of picks up on the next question, and I know we were going to deal with, but this is the issue at the moment. The whole issue of, it started with cladding and ACM. It's now much broader. It is a huge problem for the industry, as in the insurance industry, and therefore it is going to be a huge problem for the construction industry. And we've already seen this with the EWS1 issues that arose, whereby the certification of building and the fire performance and specifications around the cladding in those buildings became almost impossible to obtain insurance coverage for. So what we are generally seeing, and picking up on your point, Michael, we're seeing the market push towards aggregate almost irrespective of claims experience for cladding, but it's now got much broader, and it's anything almost related to the fire safety performance of the building, which could be, I mean, it could be almost anything now. We've got much broader than just cladding. You know, it's bringing and dragging in M&E engineers through things like the fire alarm, sprinkler systems. The insurance market is taking a big step away from this, and so at the moment, most clients, certainly from G&A's perspective, are seeing their cover restricted to aggregate for cladding and fire safety notices. If we're honest about it, we think the fire safety issue is going to get worse, and we're likely to see more use of outright exclusions. Now, we've been in discussions with the government, as I know, have lots of bodies, and the government have made some announcements about this, but the reality is that it's still pretty vague. But the insurance market is not going to step back in tomorrow at the moment. I mean, I spoke to one underwriter the other week, and he was saying, basically, I've got absolutely no faith whatsoever in what a manufacturer says about the performance specification of its building, because you just listen to what's said at the Grenfell inquiry, and you know the outright fraud that was taking place in that regard. So whether the new or the ongoing investigation and post Grenfell results change the dynamics remains to be seen. But at the moment, from where we're sat, almost the government is going to have to step in with some kind of solution, be it in a similar way that it did to flood and historically for terrorism, because otherwise we're going to see things ground to a halt. And it's that important, quite frankly. The government wants to drive construction, rightly so. The economy needs it to happen, but the insurance industry are going to be a bit of a roadblock to that.
No, completely, and I think it's something that will rumble on for a while, really. Just moving on slightly from that, Michael. Roger then mentioned aggregate limits. One of the things that we see within the team is a difference between aggregate limits and cover in respect of each and every claim. Can you just explain this a little bit, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll come on to that in 1 second, if I may, just to come back briefly on the point that Roger was making a moment ago. I think it's important to remember we tend to see things when we're negotiating contracts which are probably a little after the event, and so consultant might renew his insurance cover, let's say 6 months ago. We then negotiate the contract on the basis of that. Roger's seeing the marketplace ahead of renewals, and so probably has the most up-to-date take on where the marketplace is. But to come back to your question, Katie, on aggregate limits, we see two sorts of cover, generally speaking. The first is what I'll call maybe a historical type of cover, which is where insurers would write indemnities in respect of each and every claim. So it didn't matter if you had more than one claim in the year, because the policy would respond to each and every claim as and when it arose, and the limit of indemnity applied to each and every claim. So let's suppose you had a £5 million limit of indemnity. You could have half a dozen £5 million claims in the year, and the policy would respond to those. What we have seen increasingly, and in fairness, probably in place for quite a long time, in things like pollution and contamination and asbestos, are aggregate limits, because the market was very concerned about multiple claims arising in relation to these type of risks. And so what they said was that the claim would be limited, and the limit, the case I've talked about, a £5 million limit, would be in the aggregate for the policy year. And so if you had claims that totaled more than £5 million in the policy year, then your cover would be exhausted. And it gives insurers also perhaps a measure of flexibility, because they will in some circumstances allow reinstatements. So you could have one £5 million claim, the policy would be reinstated, and you could have a second £5 million claim. But if there was only one reinstatement, then that was the extent of your cover. And these are devices really used by insurers in terms of managing the risk that they face, because they can apply different excesses and things like that. And it's a means of them controlling the degree of exposure they have. I think one of the things that we've been a bit mystified about, it's fair to say, is circumstances where insurers say they give unlimited reinstatements, which rather seems to contradict the purpose of the arrangement. But that's not a very common experience we have. As I say, generally speaking, we have each and every claim limits, which are fine, and certainly what we like to see from consultants and contractors. Aggregate limits are pretty widely accepted in terms of pollution, contamination, and are becoming increasingly common, as Roger said, in relation to cladding and fire prevention claims. So I don't know, Roger, if there's anything that you want to add to that.
I think the things I'd pick up on that are most consultants at the moment anyway can still get each and every claim basis of cover, but are almost certainly will all face aggregate limits for cladding and fire safety. From the contractor's perspective, outside of the really large contractors, most contractors now, their options are very limited, and almost all of those contractors are going to end up on an aggregate basis. So your Balfour Beatties of this world may still be able to get each and every, but most contractors can only really get aggregate cover. And most contractors are also facing the biggest challenges in terms of the financial cost of purchasing their PI cover. So whereas they may historically have obtained 10 million each and every basis of cover for, I don't know, let's pick a figure out of mid-air, 500,000 at last year's renewal. This year's renewal, it might be $1 million for 5 million aggregate. And therefore, most contractors are now challenging the employers in terms of the limits that they can offer and in terms of their affordability. And I think picking up on an earlier point that you made, Michael, this is the big challenge with PI cover because it's written on a claims made basis. It's not the policy that's entered into when the contract was first signed that deals with the claim, or indeed when the negligent advice or specification may have happened. It's the policy when the claim comes to fruition and is known about that deals with that claim. And what we are seeing is increasingly contractors want to purchase less cover, and increasingly contractors are going back to employers and saying, well, we may have signed up to 10 million each and every, we can now only get 5 million aggregate.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And one of the things that for me flowing from that would be that often we're told that cover being offered by a particular consultant or a subcontractor is the best available in the marketplace. Is there really any easy way of checking if that's the case?
Do you want the short or long answer? The short answer is no. I mean, it is very challenging because to most contractors and consultants, this is their private information. They don't necessarily want to share. It could be driven by their own claims record. It could be driven simply by affordability. All you can do is ask the questions. In theory, you could go further and say, well, can you evidence which insurers you've approached to demonstrate that this is the best available? But again, a lot of contractors and consultants would just treat that information as commercially sensitive. I think there just needs to be a recognition that it is a very challenging insurance market. Everyone, more or less, and you can tell by the number of attendees at an insurance-related webinar, it knows about it now. It just needs to try to be some kind of open dialogue between the parties involved, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think for that, the team also sometimes gets told that the need for particular restrictions in an appointment comes from the insurers themselves. So there might be the open dialogue between the employer and the contractor, but then it becomes an issue for that it's being blocked by the insurers. I guess it's a question for both of you. What is your experience of dealing with that?
Well, we certainly do get told that things are requirements of insurers. My experience is, generally speaking, that I've not seen policies that contain those sort of requirements. So some of the things like net contribution clauses or necessarily limitation on liability clauses. I haven't seen those sort of policies so far, but I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that these are examples of prudent risk management by consultants and contractors, and it helps them if they let's suppose you've got a contractor who's got a 10 million limit of indemnity, and he can negotiate so that on a number of contracts he has a 2 million limit of liability, on a number of contracts he has a 5 million limit on liability, and he goes to his insurer for renewal in the next year and says, look, 50% of my contracts I've got a £2 million limit on liability, 30% I've got a 5 million limit on liability. Okay, the overall limit on liability for you is 10 million, but you're not exposed to that so much on the overall basket of contracts we've got. So I think it's prudent risk management, but as things stand at the moment, I haven't seen any policies that are particularly insistent upon those sort of limitations. I don't know if Roger's got a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, there could be some policies out there that will have this. There is also a bit of smoke and mirrors as well on behalf of some consultants and contractors. But I go back to the price mechanism I mentioned in the previous question. If someone was paying $500,000 for 10 million cover last year and is now paying a million for 5 million cover this year, then it's a challenge, and that's the scenario that a lot of firms are facing. The reality is most employers, unfortunately, are not willing to pay a price reflective of the contract. So I suppose, you know, if it's a small contract and the employer's insisting on 10 or 20 million limit of indemnity, then commercial decisions need to be made as to, well, we're not willing to provide that cover for this type of work at those level of fees. I would say work with a team you know and can trust. Try and achieve a collaborative approach. Not always possible, we know. But with regards to contract negotiations, there does need to be an open and to some extent early dialogue. Don't historically, insurance is always left to the last minute. Don't do that. Get involved early on, understand what the positions are. But the employer always has a choice. He can go and employ Balfour Beatty or an Arab. They'll provide them the indemnity limit they want, but you know, they'll charge the fees that the client doesn't want to pay. So there does need to be compromise, quite frankly.
No, that's really useful. So I think that's everything that we've covered for our scripted questions. So I think we'll move on to audience question and answer now. Roger, I know you've already touched upon this with the discussions about Grenfell. One of the questions that we've had is that someone's recently inquired to procure insurance for a client with a very large site and looking to deal with the insulation roof and the upper wall cladding. They were advised that they couldn't be guaranteed cover. Is this likely to be an ongoing issue, as there's a lot of buildings with this sort of non-compliant historic composite cladding and roofing?
Yeah, it is a big issue. And I mean, if it wasn't for COVID, this would be all over the front page of the newspapers, and has been in many cases. You know, you've got all these poor leaseholders who are sat in buildings through no fault of their own with combustible cladding, and it's either impossible, although nothing's impossible, but difficult to get insurance cover, but the premiums are through the roof. There are very limited markets that will write this stuff. You know, you may have paid 10,000 last year, and I've seen these, it'll be $500,000 this year as a premium. So at that kind of pricing, and we've also seen clients go down this direction, it becomes more economic to actually remove the cladding over a period. That may cost a couple of million, but will have paid for itself in 2 to 3 years. And we've got several clients that's exactly what they're doing. They're removing the combustible cladding to make the insurance placement going forward, you know, back to a normal level, because we're not going to go back to a level where, you know, pricing is not going to come back for this. We're at the level we are. There are a few insurers. The wordings are absolutely terrible.
I'm not sure whether we've lost Roger there a little bit. I think he's just frozen on my screen.
Sorry,
he's back.
Yeah, I think I'm back. To me, it is just about, probably the best strategy is if possible to get that cladding removed.
Yeah, no, it seems like it's going to be very, very challenging. And I guess the question for both of you is where do you see the next 12 months going?
Oh, we've lost your volume, Katie.
Oh, we've lost my volume.
I heard it all right, so perhaps I'll come back. I think I'd go back to the point that I made before, that actually I see the market continuing to harden, to be quite honest with you. I think that we'll see a more information coming out of Grenfell in due course, and I think once the insurers see that they can
am I better off coming back in?
Get a firmer marketplace, that they will want to continue to obtain the benefit of increased premiums, and preferably for a slightly reduced cover. So to be honest with you, I see the market continuing to remain hard and quite possibly getting firmer.
Sorry about that, an IT issue at my end.
No, don't worry. We're just talking about how we see the next 12 months going.
From an insurance perspective, it's going to be horrible, I think, quite frankly. which isn't great for most of the people in attendance here. Yeah, well, as we've already talked, fire and cladding are going to be very, very difficult. The one other thing that we are seeing is cyber exclusions are getting imposed now, and these worries, if we're being totally honest, they can be very broad in how they're written. We do have some concerns about what the market's trying to achieve here. There's no consistency, but there is a danger, certainly from a damage perspective, that, and everything's ran through IT. There is a danger that we could have a claim through something that's been designed on a CAD system that might not be insured because of these cyber exclusions. So yeah, yeah, very challenging, I think, is what the next 12 months is going to look like.
Okay, a couple of questions that we've got coming through. One is from an employer's perspective. We've recently also had pushback for product limits of indemnity. Is this a result of contractors' squeezed insurance budgets as a result of PI increases or market changes in the area too?
I've not really seen any restrictions on products liability, if I'm being honest. So I'm surprised that that's a problem. Rates are going up, but not so much in that line that it should be a problem. We've had no problems with any of our clients in terms of products liability. I suppose it could be back to what's the product, and there might be something that's, you know, deemed a high risk product that you know, if you're, let's go back to, if you're providing combustible cladding, then you might well have a challenge in as a product liability perspective that could drive that. But otherwise, generally, on a broader perspective, I've not seen the challenge on products liability.
Okay, that's fine. I think we probably have touched upon the answer to this, but I'll ask the question anyway. Is it also your experience that the excesses and deductibles have increased substantially this year, and is that going to continue?
Yes, they've increased substantially, probably over the last few years. Will it continue? I mean, you kind of hope that things will level itself out, quite frankly, in that regard. And similarly with pricing, I mean, we will get to the position maybe in 12 months, 18 months time, where some insurers are going to be sat there and thinking, we're making money here, we'd like to write more of this, and then prices will start to come down. Deductibles will start to come down. I'd like to think deductibles have more or less, for those that have been through the renewal cycle, have levelled off, quite frankly.
Yeah, and then another question kind of from the leaseholder perspective. In many cases, the removal of cladding is unaffordable for leaseholders. If buildings were remediated to be a B1 rating, so some combustible material retained, do you think that that insurance cover would remain exceptionally high in those circumstances?
It would still be a challenge.
Yeah.
It might make a difference, but at the moment, yeah, it would, unfortunately, from their perspective, would still be a challenge.
Okay, and just following on from that, is there any advice for fire engineers having to withdraw from cladding remediation schemes because they can't get PI? Is there any suggestions on what they can do to get the PI for this kind of work?
I wish I could give a more positive answer, but at the moment, I think there's been a few surveys done. RICS did one, and there's something like 30 or 40% of people who are turning work down because they've not got the relevant related PI coverage that they need or are being asked to provide. I mean, there may be a few very specialist markets out there, but it will be expensive. My instinct is going back to the government really probably need to provide the solution here. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah. And then just one more question, just expanding on the point you've just made about CAD. Where do you see this being a potential issue for contractors themselves?
Well, potentially, I mean, on a contract works policy, the policy covers loss or damage to the works itself. There is a potential that if something can be the proximate cause of that damage can be traced back to some IT related issue. Take a fire alarm. If the fire alarm doesn't work because of some IT related issue, the policy would normally respond because it's during construction, but it won't respond potentially with some of these cyber exclusions. They give me sleepless nights, if I'm being honest. They really do. Well, on what's being driven, but it seems as though it's almost non-negotiable with insurers at the moment.
No, totally. And then just finally, just kind of wrapping everything up, question for both of you. Michael, I'll come to you first, just about top tips. So Michael, do you have top tips for our clients going forwards?
Certainly, I think I'd echo what Roger says in terms of early engagement, thinking about where the risk is going to lie, how it's going to be managed. If you're thinking of a new development, think about that first up, not once you've got all the funding in place and you're about to press the button on the various construction contracts. Do engage early. For clients, I think really the appreciation that risks are not going to be so readily covered as they were before, and work with the contractors and consultants to make sure you get the best management of that risk.
And Roger, kind of same question to you. Do you have top tips in terms of placing insurance risks and what people can be doing going forwards?
Yeah, again, I'd only reiterate the early engagement. Absolutely. The last minute is lastminute.com doesn't work anymore in insurance. Be ready and be expecting to provide much more detailed information than you've previously will have been asked for. I would say this, but work with an insurance broker who understands the market and can assist you in collating the relevant information. And finally, be nice, because it is a difficult market, where the insurers and brokers are not responsible for this outcome. One of my colleagues used this, but be nice. It's just a nice thing to not throw the toys out the pram over.
No, exactly. And I think, those tips are really, really useful for the people on this call. And I think, all of that information is incredibly helpful. So thank you, Michael, and thank you to you as well, Roger, for addressing these questions, because I think, there's been a lot of detail there and that's been very, very helpful. Thank you to everyone that's on the call and has attended today, and for the questions that you've put forward and asked. They've been very helpful. As we said at the start, there will be a recording of this, which will be circulated to you in due course. So again, thank you, Roger, thank you, Michael, and have a great afternoon, everybody.